Coldwater Penitentiary, a black inmate was about to become the spark that lit a fire no one could extinguish. What started as a torn calendar and a staged fight spiraled when Sergeant Ray Kincaid, an old-school white guard with a god complex, ordered Malik Ramsey's classroom dismantled and his influence erased. Malik Ramsey wasn't your typical inmate. For 3 years he'd endured the grind of Coldwater's racial hierarchies and psychological warfare, known for his razor intellect, former life as a teacher, and unnerving calm in the face of brutality. When Kincaid planted surveillance in his Bible, isolated him in solitary without charges, and suspended his attorney's visits, he had no idea he was messing with a man who had been planning for this moment all along. Ramsey responded not with violence but with scripture, strategy, and a series of coded lessons that would spark an ideological insurgency across cell blocks and chapel pews alike. What began as routine abuse of power would become a dramatic reckoning. The prison would never forget the day Sergeant Kincaid realized he wasn't crushing a rebellion, he was fueling it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Coldwater Penitentiary buzzed like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across the concrete corridor of the segregated housing unit. C.O. Brian Gentry fought to keep his breathing steady as he followed Sergeant Ray Kincaid's measured footsteps. 3 weeks into the job, and Gentry still couldn't shake the feeling of walking into the belly of some ancient beast each time he passed through the reinforced doors. First rule of Coldwater, Gentry, Kincaid said without turning around, his shoulders squared beneath his crisp uniform. Order must be maintained. The morning inspection had been uneventful until they reached cell 221. Kincaid stopped abruptly, his face hardening as he peered through the narrow observation window. "Jenkins?" Kincaid's voice cut through the relative quiet. "What's that on? Your wall?" Inside, a middle-aged black man looked up from his thin mattress, confusion crossing his features. "It's just a calendar, sir. Chaplain approved." Kincaid's jaw tightened. "That's not regulation positioning. 3 inches too high." He keyed his radio. "Need an extraction team at 221. Inmate refuses to comply with direct orders." Gentry blinked. Jenkins hadn't refused anything. Within minutes, 4 officers in riot gear thundered down the corridor. Gentry pressed himself against the wall as Kincaid nodded toward the cell door. "On my count," Kincaid announced, his voice carrying a rehearsed cadence. 3, 2, 1. The door burst open. Jenkins barely had time to stand before he disappeared beneath a pile of armored bodies. Gentry watched, stomach churning, as they dragged the man face down into the corridor. "Stop resisting," one guard shouted, though Jenkins lay limp beneath their grip. Kincaid crouched beside Jenkins' head. "When an officer gives you an instruction, you follow it. First time, every time." He nodded to the team. 48 hours in the hole. Let him think about his choices. As they dragged Jenkins away, leaving the calendar torn on the floor, Gentry caught sight of a face in the narrow window of cell 219. Dark eyes watched with unnerving stillness. Not angry, not afraid, just observing. The man's gaze shifted, to meet Gentry's for just a moment before retreating back into the shadows. "Who's that?" Gentry asked, nodding toward the cell. Kincaid's expression soured. "Malik Ramsey. Thinks he's above the rest because he was some kind of teacher on the outside. Calls himself Teach. 25 to life for dealing to kids." He lowered his voice. "Between us, he's more dangerous than half the violent offenders in here. Quiet. Ones always are." In the yard that afternoon, Gentry stood watch from the perimeter walkway. The Mississippi heat pressed down like a weighted blanket, but Kincaid didn't seem to notice as he surveilled the clusters of inmates below. "See how they self-segregate?" Kincaid pointed. "Natural order. White boys with white, blacks with blacks, Mexicans with Mexicans. Makes our job easier when they follow their instincts." Gentry nodded uncomfortably. His eyes drifted to a concrete table where Malik Ramsey sat alone, reading a worn paperback. Unlike the others who hunched forward or constantly scanned their surroundings, Ramsey sat with his back straight, occasionally turning a page with deliberate care. "Eyes up, Gentry," Kincaid snapped. Something's about to pop off. Gentry followed Kincaid's gaze to where two inmates, one black, one Latino, were approaching the same water fountain. The younger black inmate reached it first. "Watch this," Kincaid murmured, keying his radio. "C.O. Wilson, inmate approaching your position could use some extra attention." The guard near the fountain nodded subtly and stepped forward, deliberately bumping the black inmate as he drank. Water splashed across his uniform. "Watch where you're standing, Washington," the guard barked. Washington's protest was cut off as the Latino inmate shoved him from behind. "Move it, bitch." Washington spun around, fists clenched. The first punch connected with a sickening crack. Guards descended within seconds. Kincaid was already halfway down the stairs, baton drawn. As they pinned Washington to the ground, Kincaid's boot pressed against the back of his neck. "Always the same with these troublemakers," Kincaid announced, loud enough for the yard to hear. "Can't control themselves." His gaze swept the silent onlookers. "Anyone else feeling rowdy today?" From his position, Gentry could see Ramsey still seated at his table, his book closed now, eyes fixed on Kincaid. "Just write what I tell you," Kincaid instructed later, as Gentry stared at the incident report form. Washington initiated physical contact after repeated verbal warnings. When ordered to stand down, he became combative, requiring physical intervention. "But sir, that's not what?" Kincaid cut him off, leaning over the desk. "Not what happened. Were you there, Officer Gentry? Did you see it differently than I did?" Gentry swallowed. "No, sir." "Good." Kincaid straightened, adjusting his badge. "Because the first thing you need to understand about Coldwater is there's what happens and there's what we say happens. Our job isn't just keeping these animals in line, it's maintaining the narrative that keeps the whole system running." A faint smile crossed Kincaid's face. "You've got potential, Gentry. Military background, family to support, not here to make waves. Just remember which side of the bars you're on." Gentry nodded and began filling out the form with Kincaid's version of events, his hand slightly unsteady. Chaplain Dale Wickers moved down the corridor of the SHU carrying a stack of new Bibles, his footsteps echoing against the concrete. His pressed shirt and cologne stood out against the sterile environment. "Special delivery for our most devoted readers," he announced, stopping at Ramsey's cell. "The Lord's word brings comfort to those who seek redemption." Ramsey approached the bars slowly. "Thank you, Chaplain." Wickers slid the Bible through the slot. "I've marked some passages I think might speak to you, Malik, about accepting rightful authority." Ramsey accepted the book with a slight nod, his expression revealing nothing. As Wickers continued down the corridor, Kincaid appeared from around the corner. "All distributed?" Kincaid asked quietly. "Just as requested," Wickers confirmed. "The microphones are embedded in the binding, completely undetectable." "Good. I want to know everything he says, everyone he speaks to." Kincaid glanced back toward Ramsey's cell. "He's planning something, I can feel it." Warden Ellis Draper's office offered the only true comfort in Coldwater: leather furniture, oak bookshelves, and air conditioning that actually worked. Kincaid stood at attention as Draper reviewed the monthly reports. "Incident rates are up 12% from last quarter," Draper noted, frowning at the spreadsheet. "That's not going to look good for our investor call next week." "Just a temporary spike, sir," Kincaid assured him. "I've implemented enhanced protocols in the trouble areas." Draper leaned back in his chair. "The board doesn't care about protocols, Ray. They care about metrics. Clean metrics mean renewed contracts." He tapped his pen against the desk. "The state pays us per inmate, but our profit margin comes from keeping costs down. Every incident report means extra paperwork, extra medical expenses, extra oversight." "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Draper's voice hardened. "Because Coldwater isn't just a prison, it's a business model. And right now, our numbers are saying we don't run a tight ship. We had a new influx from county last month. They're still adjusting to the Coldwater way." Draper sighed. "Just keep the numbers clean, Ray, whatever it takes." He glanced at his watch. "I've got the governor's office on the line in 10. Make sure next month's report tells a better story." In his cell that night, Malik Ramsey sat on the edge of his bed, the Bible open in his lap. His fingers traced the slightly raised area in the binding where the microphone was hidden. Imperceptible to most, but not to someone who had spent 3 years noticing every detail of his environment. He turned to Psalms, where Wickers had inserted a marker, and read aloud, "The wicked plot against the righteous and gnash their teeth at them, but the Lord laughs at the wicked, for he knows their day is coming." Ramsey closed the Bible gently and placed it on his small metal desk, positioning it carefully toward the cell door. He moved to the sink in the corner, turned on the water, and leaned close to the mirror. In the reflection, he could see the Bible on the desk behind him. "Not yet," he whispered to himself, the words drowned out by the running water. "But soon." He splashed water on his face and returned to his bed, lying down with his hands folded across his chest. In the cell beside his, he could hear Jenkins returning from his stint in solitary, coughing painfully as the guards shoved him inside. The lights of the SHU dimmed for the night, plunging the corridor into semi-darkness. But Ramsey kept his eyes open, counting the seconds between the guard patrols, memorizing the rhythm of Coldwater's pulse, finding the gaps where a careful man might slip through the cracks of Kincaid's carefully constructed order. Tomorrow, he would begin testing those cracks one by one. The prison classroom was barely distinguishable from a storage closet, a converted supply room with mismatched desks, flickering fluorescents, and a smell of industrial cleaner that never quite faded. But to Malik Ramsey, it was the closest thing to freedom he'd known in 3 years. "Books open to page 47, he instructed, his voice measured yet caring to every corner of the small room. 8 inmates shifted in their chairs, the sound of turning pages filling the silence. A guard stood by the door, arms crossed, eyes vacant with boredom. Teach ran his finger along the worn copy of Native Son by Richard Wright. The book list had been heavily censored, but Warden Draper had allowed this one, likely because he'd never read it himself. "Today we're discussing Bigger Thomas's reactions to his environment," Teach continued. "Consider how the author shows a man whose choices are shaped by systems designed to control him." At the back of the room, a muscular man with intricate tattoos snaking up his neck leaned forward. Reggie Holloway, known as Smoke for the cigarette burns that dotted his forearms, had joined the class a week ago. Rumor had it he controlled half the contraband in Coldwater's East Wing. "You asking us to sympathize with a murderer?" Smoke challenged, eyes narrowing. Teach met his gaze steadily. "I'm asking you to understand how environments create behaviors. When a man is caged, physically or socially, he doesn't make choices, the same way as a free man." Another inmate, Jones, nodded slowly. "Like how they make the rules here impossible to follow completely, so they always got a reason to put you in the hole if they want." "That's what Wright was exploring," Teach replied, careful not to explicitly endorse the comparison. "Systems that predetermine outcomes while maintaining the illusion of choice." The guard at the door shifted his weight, attention momentarily caught by the conversation. Teach smoothly redirected. "Let's look at page 53 where Bigger describes the white blur that dictates his existence. Notice the language of invisibility, the power that shapes his life without showing its hand." As the discussion continued, Teach wove between direct analysis of the text and broader implications. To a casual observer, or the surveillance microphone, tucked into his Bible back in his cell, he was simply teaching literature. But to men starved for meaning, for some explanation of the forces that had brought them to Coldwater, the subtext was unmistakable. Near the end of the session, he assigned a writing exercise, a 1-page reflection on a system in your life that shaped your choices, for better or worse. This is for your eyes only, not for submission. As the inmates filed out, Smoke lingered, behind. When they were momentarily alone, he leaned in close. "Pretty words don't unlock doors, Teach," he muttered. "All this metaphor shit, it's just a distraction. Men in here need action, not book club." Teach carefully organized his papers. "Every action begins as a thought, Holloway. Before you can change a system, you have to see it clearly." He looked up. Reading might not bend steel, but it bends minds, and minds are what built these walls in the first place. Smoke scoffed, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of curiosity beneath the contempt. We'll see how far your books get you when Kincaid decides you're a problem. He tapped his temple. I've survived in places like this by hitting first, hitting hard. And yet here you are, Teach observed quietly, in my classroom instead of the yard. Smoke had no answer for that. He shook his head and walked out, shoulders tense beneath his prison-issued shirt. The chapel occupied the old gymnasium, its high ceilings and poor acoustics lending Chaplain Wicker's voice a hollow, echoing quality as he paced before the assembled inmates. Morning sunlight filtered through narrow, mesh-covered windows, creating a dusty haze that seemed to hang perpetually in the air. Submission to authority, Wickers intoned, his Bible held aloft like a shield, is the cornerstone of redemption. Romans 13 tells us, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." From his position near the back wall, C.O. Gentry surveyed the rows of seated inmates. Teach sat in the middle, his posture relaxed but attentive, while Smoke slouched several rows behind, eyes half-lidded. The double doors at the rear of the chapel swung open with a metallic groan. Sergeant Kincaid entered, his presence immediately tensing the atmosphere. He nodded to Wickers without breaking stride, then positioned himself beside Gentry. "Good turnout," Kincaid observed quietly. "Faith is a powerful motivator." "Yes, sir," Gentry replied. "Recognize the benefit of what we're doing here, Gentry. Every man in this room is learning his place in the order of things. Wickers may be preaching about heaven, but what they're really absorbing is the chain of command." Wickers continued with increasing fervor. "Those who resist authority bring judgment on themselves. This is God's word." His finger jabbed the air for emphasis. "Many of you came to Coldwater because you placed yourself above the law. Your path to redemption lies in humility, in accepting your rightful position." Gentry noticed Teach's head tilt slightly, his attention shifting toward Kincaid rather than the chaplain. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the room, and Gentry felt an unsettling sensation, as if Teach were seeing straight through him. "Inmates participating in our faith-based programs show a 60% reduction in disciplinary incidents," Kincaid continued, oblivious to the exchange. "Not because they found Jesus, but because they've accepted the reality of their situation. Acceptance means compliance." "And those who don't accept?" Gentry asked. Kincaid's smile didn't reach his eyes. "They learn the hard way that resistance only extends their suffering." He nodded toward Teach. "That one's been reading the Bible I gave him, every night like clockwork, but I don't think he's getting the right message." As the service ended, inmates filed out row by row under the watchful eyes of the guards. Kincaid approached Wickers, who was gathering his materials from the lectern. "Excellent message today, Chaplain," Kincaid said, loud enough for nearby inmates to hear. "Your guidance is invaluable to these men." "Just doing the Lord's work, Sergeant," Wickers replied, his pious expression at odds with the calculating look in his eyes. "With your continued support, of course." "I've been reviewing the recordings from our special study materials," Kincaid said more quietly. "Ramsey's been remarkably careful with what he says in his cell, almost as if he knows." Wickers frowned. "Impossible. The technology is undetectable. Maybe to most, but our former teacher friend notices things." Kincaid's jaw tightened. "Increase surveillance during his reading group. I want to know what ideas he's planting." The prison library was little more than a converted storage room, its shelves stocked with donated paperbacks, outdated textbooks, and carefully screened religious materials. C.O. Gentry stood at the entrance, overseeing the afternoon library period with minimal enthusiasm. His mind kept returning to the incident report he'd falsified 3 days ago. The official record now showed Washington as the aggressor, earning him 30 days in solitary and a permanent mark on his record that would affect parole consideration, all for being shoved at a water fountain in a scenario Kincaid had orchestrated. Officer Gentry? Gentry startled from his thoughts. Teach stood before him, holding a worn copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X. This was on the restricted shelf, Gentry said automatically. It was actually approved last month, Teach replied calmly. Warden Draper signed off after the new educational initiative. You can check the updated list. Gentry hesitated, then took the book, flipping through it with feigned scrutiny. A small slip of paper fell out, a handwritten study guide with questions about systemic change and nonviolent resistance, questions that pushed dangerously close to the boundaries of what Coldwater would tolerate. He should report this. It was exactly the kind of material Kincaid was looking for, evidence of subversive thinking. Instead, he found himself slipping, the paper back between the pages. Seems in order, he said, returning the book. Just remember, any materials discussed in your reading group need prior approval. Something shifted in Teach's expression. A flicker of surprise quickly masked. Of course, officer. Rules are rules. As Teach turned away, Gentry added quietly, Not all rules make sense, though, do they? Teach paused, but didn't turn around. Sense doesn't enter into it, Officer Gentry. Only power. He continued to his table where several inmates were already gathered. Gentry watched as Teach began speaking to the small group, his voice too low to hear from the doorway. Whatever he was saying held their complete attention. Men who normally couldn't sit still for 5 minutes were leaning forward, engaged in a way Gentry had never seen before. Later that evening, as Gentry conducted his final cell check before the night shift change, he paused outside Teach's cell. Teach sat on his bunk, reading by the dim overhead light. Found something you might be interested in, Gentry said, glancing down the corridor to ensure they were alone. He slipped a thin volume through the meal slot, Howard Zinn's You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train. Teach accepted the book without expression, but his eyes asked the question. Sometimes you need to understand the whole board, not just the pieces in front of you, Gentry said, feeling foolish for the cryptic statement. This was confiscated from the community college donations, never made it to the official library. Why? Teach asked simply. Gentry didn't have a good answer. That report on Washington, it wasn't right. None of this is. He straightened, his uniform nervously. Just read it quick and pass it on. Don't tell anyone where it came from. A faint smile crossed Teach's face, the first Gentry had seen. Officer, in here, the source of knowledge is often as important as the knowledge itself. 2 days later in the classroom, Teach stood writing on the small whiteboard as his students arrived. The day's topic was bold in black marker, allegory and hidden meanings. As the session began, the door opened and smoke entered, followed by 2 inmates who had never attended before. The room fell silent as they took seats at the back. Heard you was teaching about hidden messages, Smoke announced. Thought my boys might benefit from some education. The tension in the room was palpable. Every inmate knew Smoke's reputation, and the presence of his associates signaled something significant. Teach nodded as if this were a completely normal development. We were just about to discuss Plato's allegory of the cave, a story about men who mistake shadows for reality because they've never seen the light. For the next hour, Teach guided the class through the ancient philosophical text, drawing parallels to contemporary media, propaganda, and the nature of perspective. He never once mentioned Coldwater or incarceration explicitly, yet the implications hung in the air like the dust motes in the chapel, visible only when they caught the light. When the session ended, Smoke's associates filed out, their expressions thoughtful. Smoke himself lingered again, waiting until the room had cleared. You think you're being smart, he said flatly, dancing around with your fancy books and metaphors. But Kincaid ain't stupid, and when he decides you're done, all these words won't protect you. I'm not looking for protection, Holloway, Teach replied. Just understanding. Understanding don't mean shit without action. Smoke leaned closer. These men respect you. They listen, But they need more than stories about caves and shadows. They need a way out, or at least a way to fight back. And what would that accomplish? More time in solitary? More years added to sentences, more deaths? Teach shook his head. Violence is what they expect. It's what the system is designed to absorb and use against us. So what's your solution? Read until the doors open? No. Teach met his gaze steadily. My solution is to change the game entirely. Not by breaking rules, but by using them in ways they never anticipated. Smoke studied him for a long moment. I still think you're dreaming, but I'll keep listening. He gestured to the book on Teach's desk. For now. As Smoke left, Teach gathered his materials, his movements unhurried. Through the classroom window, he could see inmates moving across the yard in their designated groups, like pieces on a chessboard, following predetermined paths. But chess pieces didn't think for themselves. They didn't question the nature of the game. They didn't realize they outnumbered the players. In his cell that night, with the water running to mask any sound from the hidden microphone, Teach began drafting his lesson plan for the next session, not on the official form that would be reviewed by prison administration, but in his mind, where the real curriculum was taking shape. The first seeds had been planted. Now it was time to nurture them, to watch them take root in minds long accustomed to barren soil. One by one, his students were beginning to see beyond the shadows on the wall, to question the nature of the chains that bound them. It wasn't revolution yet, not even close, but it was a beginning. The chapel's evening prayer circle met in the back corner of the converted gymnasium, far from the surveillance cameras that monitored the main seating area. 12 plastic chairs arranged in a tight ring created an island of relative privacy, an oversight in Coldwater's otherwise comprehensive security net that Chaplain Wickers had justified as necessary for pastoral confidentiality. Teach sat, with his hands folded loosely in his lap, eyes closed as Wickers led the group in prayer. But behind his eyelids, his attention remained razor-sharp, cataloging every shift, every whisper, every subtle reaction from the men around him. And Lord, guide these men to accept their circumstances as part of your divine plan, Wickers intoned, his manicured hands raised skyward. Help them find peace in submission to rightful authority, knowing that their sentence on earth is but a moment compared to eternity. Teach opened his eyes slightly, watching the varied responses to this particular theology. Jones nodded along eagerly. Martinez stared at the floor, jaw tight. Washington, recently returned from solitary, kept his expression carefully blank. Now, brothers, Wickers continued, let us share our struggles and seek guidance. Remember, honesty before God is the path to redemption. As inmates began to speak, carefully edited versions of their struggles, suitable for both divine and institutional ears, Teach waited for his moment. When his turn came, he spoke softly, deliberately. I've been reflecting on Psalm 146, he said. It warns us not to put our trust in princes, in human beings who cannot save. Instead, it speaks of a God who upholds the cause of the oppressed, gives food to the hungry, and sets prisoners free. He paused, letting the words settle. I've been wondering what that means for us in here. How do we reconcile our faith with our reality? The question hung in the air like smoke, innocuous on the surface, incendiary underneath. It means patience. Brother Ramsey, Wickers responded quickly. God works in his time, not ours. Of course, Teach agreed amenably, but doesn't it also suggest that true authority comes from justice? That systems which oppress rather than uplift might not be divinely ordained after all? A subtle tension rippled through the circle. Martinez nodded almost imperceptibly. Washington's eyes widened slightly. Two men, Peterson and Turner, exchanged uncomfortable glances. That's dangerously close to advocating disobedience, Ramsey, Wickers warned, his pious tone hardening. Not at all, Chaplain, Teach replied. Just exploring Scripture's complex view of authority. After all, both Daniel and Peter chose divine law over human law when the two conflicted. The discomfort was palpable now. Peterson shifted in his seat, eyes darting toward the chapel door where a guard stood watch. Turner's hand twitched toward the pocket where inmates knew Wickers kept the small notebook that tracked spiritual progress, and by extension, behavior relevant to parole considerations. Teach noted both reactions carefully. They'd revealed themselves with their fear. "I think Brother Ramsey is overthinking things," Turner offered with forced casualness. "The Bible's pretty clear about following rules." "Perhaps," Teach conceded, "though it's equally clear about speaking truth to power. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God?" Wickers cleared his throat. "Let's move on. Brother Washington, would you like to share?" As Washington began speaking, Teach caught Smoke's eye across the circle. The man's expression had changed from his usual skepticism to something more calculated, more thoughtful. He'd been watching the subtle dynamics play out, and judging by the slight nod he gave Teach, he'd noticed the same tells from Peterson and Turner. After the session ended, inmates filed out under supervision. Teach deliberately dropped his Bible, kneeling to retrieve it as Peterson and Turner passed by. Neither man paused to help, a small but telling detail in a place where alliances were expressed through tiny gestures of solidarity. "Interesting discussion today," Smoke murmured as he passed, not breaking stride. "Especially how some brothers got real nervous about Scripture." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sergeant Kincaid stood in the narrow observation room that overlooked the education wing, arms crossed as he watched Teach's literature class through one-way glass. C.O. Gentry stood beside him, uncomfortable under Kincaid's scrutiny. "Tell me what you see, Gentry," Kincaid instructed. Gentry peered through the window at the 8 inmates, sitting in a semicircle around Teach. "Looks like they're discussing a book, sir." "What I see," Kincaid said, "is a man building a congregation. Look at their body language. They're not just listening, they're converting." He turned to face Gentry directly. "You spend time in that room. What exactly is Ramsey teaching them?" "Classic literature, sir. Essays on American history. Nothing political." "Nothing explicitly political," Kincaid corrected. "But that's how insurrection starts. Ideas wrapped in just enough legitimacy to slip past inspection." He studied Gentry's face. "You admire him, don't you?" Gentry stiffened. "No, sir, You just what? Think he's innocent? Think he's been wronged by the system?" Kincaid stepped closer. "Let me remind you of something, officer. That man down there was caught with 5 kilos of heroin in his school desk, in an elementary school. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict." Gentry swallowed hard, unable to hide his surprise. "I thought it was high school." Kincaid's eyes narrowed. "You've been talking to him?" "No, sir, You've been getting too familiar. That's a dangerous road, Gentry." Kincaid's voice dropped. "These men aren't misunderstood victims, they're manipulators, liars, predators. That's how they survived on the outside, and it's how they operate in here. The moment you forget that is the moment you compromise security." "Yes, sir. I'm assigning you to tower duty for the next week. Some distance will help you regain perspective." Kincaid turned back to the window. "And Gentry, if I find out you've been passing messages or materials to any inmate, your career will be the least of your concerns." The threat hung in the air between them, its implications unmistakable. The next morning, inmates entering the chapel found Chaplain Wickers proudly displaying the improvements made overnight. New inspirational posters adorned the walls, each featuring a surveillance camera discreetly mounted in the corner. 2 additional guards had been stationed at the sides of the room, and a metal detector frame stood at the entrance. "Brothers, rejoice in these security enhancements," Wickers announced, beaming. "With these measures in place, Warden Draper has approved extended chapel hours and additional programming. Our spiritual community will flourish under greater protection." As inmates filed through the metal detector, Teach noted the precise layout of the new surveillance infrastructure. Each camera's position, each guard's sightline, created a map of observation, and by extension, a map of blind spots. Midway, through Wicker's sermon on the prodigal son, heavily modified to emphasize punishment before forgiveness, the chapel doors swung open. Kincaid entered, followed by a technician carrying monitoring equipment. They proceeded to a small room off the main chapel that had previously been used for storage. The technician began installing what appeared to be a monitoring station. Wickers barely missed a beat. And so, brothers, we see that consequences must precede redemption. The prodigal suffered in the pig pen before returning home. After the service, as inmates queued to exit through the single approved doorway, Teach found himself standing next to Peterson. The man couldn't meet his eyes. "Something troubling you, brother?" Teach asked quietly. "Just trying to stay right with the Lord," Peterson muttered. "And with Coldwater?" "Interesting that you distinguish between the two." Peterson finally looked up, fear and resentment mingling in his expression. "Man's gotta do what he's gotta do to survive. You think your book club's gonna get anybody out of here? Cooperation gets results." "Cooperation or collaboration?" Teach asked mildly. Peterson's face flushed. "You don't know nothing about my situation. I know Kincaid promises reduced sentences for information. I know Turner jumped to parole, hearings ahead of schedule after he started reporting on the Muslim prayer group." Teach kept his voice neutral, a simple statement of observed facts. "And I know those promises rarely materialize into actual freedom." "You calling me a snitch?" Peterson hissed. "I'm suggesting that faith placed in false prophets might not be rewarded as expected." Before Peterson could respond, they reached the door. The guard waved Peterson through, then deliberately slowed Teach's exit, making a show of an extra security check. In the yard that afternoon, the usual divisions were in sharp relief. White inmates clustered near the weight pile. Black inmates dominated the basketball court. Latino inmates claimed the tables nearest the fence. Smaller groups formed their own defensive formations throughout the space, alliances of necessity, in a world where isolation meant vulnerability. Teach sat at his usual table reading quietly when a commotion erupted near the water fountain. A wiry inmate named Diaz was backing away from two larger men, hands raised defensively. "I didn't take nothing from your cell, Smoke, I swear," Diaz protested, voice cracking. Smoke advanced slowly, his face a mask of controlled rage. "My cellie. Saw you coming out. Now my pictures of my kid are gone. Only thing in that cell worth taking." A crowd began to gather, sensing the impending violence. Guards on the perimeter watched with calculated indifference. Standard procedure was to let fights burn out briefly before intervention, especially when contained among racial lines. "Maybe your cellie's confused," Diaz suggested, eyes darting. "For an escape route. I was delivering commissary sheets, that's all." "Funny thing," Smoke countered. "Turner tells me he saw you heading straight to the guard's station after. Had a real private conversation with Officer Wilson." The accusation hung in the air. Informant. Rat. Snitch. In prison hierarchy there was no lower position, no greater sin. Diaz paled. "That's a lie. Turner's the one talking to guards. He's Kincaid's pet. Everyone knows it." Smoke was within, striking distance now, fists clenched at his sides. The yard had gone quiet, all eyes on the confrontation. Even the guards had straightened, hands moving to batons. One wrong move and Smoke would earn himself a month in solitary minimum. One right move and he'd cement his reputation as an enforcer not to be crossed. Teach closed his book and stood, not approaching, but making himself visible in Smoke's peripheral vision. Time seemed to suspend as Smoke stood there, coiled energy radiating from his frame. Then, unexpectedly, he unclenched his fists. "You know what? Not worth it," he announced loudly. "But I'm watching you, Diaz. We all are." The crowd murmured, in surprise. Smoke backing down was unprecedented. Some might read it as weakness, but the calculated menace in his voice made it clear this wasn't surrender. It was strategic restraint. As the gathering dispersed, disappointed at the lack of blood, Smoke passed by Teach's table. Your influence is showing, Teach said quietly. Don't flatter yourself, Smoke retorted, but without his usual edge. Just decided the hole isn't worth it today. Either way, it was the smart play. Diaz isn't worth the trouble, and now you've put Turner in the spotlight instead. Smoke paused, surprising himself with a short laugh. Maybe there's something to your chess game after all. Teach. His expression hardened again. But Turner ain't the only one feeding Kincaid information. This place is full of men who'd sell their mother for an extra dessert. I'm aware, Teach replied. That's why trust has to be earned, not assumed. You just earned some. Kincaid stood in the small monitoring room adjacent to the chapel, watching. Recorded footage from the prayer circle on a newly installed screen. The angle was poor, deliberately positioned to respect the appearance of confidentiality while still capturing faces and basic interactions. There, he said, pointing to the screen where Teach was speaking. Rewind and amplify the audio. The technician adjusted the controls, but the sound remained muddy. Sorry, sir. The acoustics in that corner are terrible. We'd need to place mics directly in the circle to get clear audio. Kincaid frowned. Wickers assured me the existing system would capture everything. The new cameras are excellent for visual surveillance, but audio has limitations, especially in a space like this with high ceilings and poor acoustics. Then we'll need to adapt, Kincaid decided. Have a microphone installed in the center table by tomorrow. Hide it in that wooden cross Wickers keeps there. As the technician nodded and made notes, Warden Draper entered the room, eyebrows raised at the setup. Impressive little command center you've built, Ray, he observed, though I don't recall approving the budget for all this equipment. It came out of the security enhancement allocation, Kincaid explained smoothly. Religious programming was identified as a vulnerability in our last inspection. And this has nothing to do with your fixation on Ramsey? Draper asked pointedly. Ramsey is leveraging these programs to build influence. The prayer circle, the reading group, they're recruiting grounds. Draper sighed. Recruiting for what exactly? A book club uprising? The man has an exemplary disciplinary record. No fights, no contraband, no trouble. That's precisely what makes him dangerous, Kincaid insisted. He's operating on a different level. The typical troublemakers are easy to control because they're predictable. Ramsey is playing a longer game. You're starting to sound paranoid, Ray. Draper glanced at the monitor, where the grainy image showed inmates filing out of the chapel. I need you focused on real problems. The incident rate in C Block is up again this month. The state inspector is coming next week, and we've got 3 new guards who need proper training, not your conspiratorial indoctrination. With respect, sir, I know these men. I know this prison. Kincaid's voice hardened. Ramsey is building something right under our noses. By the time it becomes obvious, it'll be too late to contain. Draper studied Kincaid's face, noting the intensity in his eyes. You've got 1 week to produce something concrete. After that, I want this equipment repurposed for general security and your attention back on priority issues. He turned to leave, then paused. And Ray? Remember what I said about metrics. We can't afford another spike in incident reports. After Draper left, Kincaid turned back to the monitor, rewinding to focus on Teach's face during the prayer circle. He froze the image on a frame where Teach was looking directly at the camera, his expression unreadable. You think you're smarter than the system? Kincaid murmured to the frozen image. They all do, eventually. But the system was designed to break men like you. In his cell that night, Teach sat cross-legged on his bunk, eyes closed in meditation. To any observer, human or electronic, he appeared to be engaged in silent prayer or contemplation. But behind his calm exterior, his mind was mapping Coldwater's invisible architecture of power and surveillance. The day had confirmed what he'd suspected. Peterson and Turner were informants. The new cameras in the chapel revealed Kincaid's growing concern. Smoke's restraint in the yard demonstrated potential for alliance beyond intellectual discussion. And Gentry's absence from his usual post suggested Kincaid was isolating potential sympathizers. The board was taking shape. Pieces were declaring. their allegiance wittingly or unwittingly. A soft tap on the wall interrupted his thoughts. 3 quick raps, a pause, then 2 more. The signal from Jenkins in the neighboring cell. Teach shifted position, turning his back to the door and leaning against the wall. "You okay?" he whispered, knowing Jenkins would hear him through the thin concrete. "Infirmary says my prescriptions." "Delayed again," Jenkins replied, voice barely audible. "3rd time this month." "Who's working the med window?" "Wilson. Said it's a supply issue." "Same Wilson who works with Kincaid on the yard setup?" "Same one," Jenkins confirmed. "Told me if I want my heart meds regular, maybe I should be more cooperative when he asks questions." Teach absorbed this information, adding it to his mental map. Medication access is leverage, another strand in the web of control. "I'll see what I can do," he promised. "Just stay calm and don't antagonize them." "Easy for you to say," Jenkins muttered. "Your life don't depend on pills." "Everyone's life in here depends on something they control," Teach replied. "That's by design. But designs can have flaws." After lights out, lying in the darkness, Teach contemplated his next move. The prayer circle and reading group were establishing foundations of trust, but they were too easily monitored, too contained. He needed to create fractures in Kincaid's system, reveal the contradictions and false promises that kept inmates divided and compliant. The parole system, the medical access, the racial provocations, all threads in the same tapestry of control. What would happen if one of those threads was pulled loose? If the carefully maintained narrative of order and rehabilitation was exposed as a sham? As he drifted toward sleep, Teach found himself recalling Plato's cave again, prisoners chained, watching shadows, mistaking them for reality. But there was more to the allegory than he'd shared in class. There was the moment when one prisoner was freed, forced to turn around and see the fire casting those shadows. The painful adjustment to a new reality. The disbelief. The resistance to truth. And then, the most dangerous part, when the freed prisoner returned to tell the others what he had seen. Tomorrow, Teach decided, it was time to start turning heads toward the fire. The visiting room at Coldwater buzzed with muted conversation, a patchwork of strained reunions and awkward silences beneath the watchful eyes of 3 guards. Teach sat across from Yvette Davis, the civil rights attorney who had taken on his appeal 6 months ago. Her tailored suit and confident posture stood in stark contrast to the institutional drabness surrounding them. "They're stonewalling us on the evidence review," Davis said, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Judge Winston denied our motion to re-examine the chain of custody for the drugs found in your classroom." Teach nodded, unsurprised. "Winston's brother sits on the board of Coldwater's parent company." "I'm aware," Davis replied crisply. "That's why we're pursuing the judicial bias angle as a secondary strategy." She tapped the folder. "There are some other cases I think might be relevant precedent. Take a look when you can." Beneath the professional exchange, their eyes communicated what could not be said aloud. Davis had been representing prisoners at Coldwater long enough to know every conversation was monitored, every interaction scrutinized. "I've also included the latest correspondence about your case," she continued, her tone deliberately neutral. "Standard procedure allows you to review all communications before they enter the court record." Teach opened the folder, flipping through several typed pages of legal arguments. Tucked between them was a handwritten note in Davis's precise script. "Check PG6 margin. Need proof of pattern. Names, dates, specifics." He turned to page 6, where a small notation in the margin simply read, "Parole anomalies." "Everything looks in order," Teach said, closing the folder. "Though I'm concerned about the timeline you've outlined for the appeal process." "Unfortunately, the system moves. At its own pace," Davis checked her watch. "I have 20 minutes left. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss regarding your case?" Teach leaned forward slightly. "Actually, I've been thinking about the inconsistencies in sentencing across similar cases, particularly how certain inmates seem to advance through the system more quickly than others despite similar charges and circumstances." Davis's eyes flickered with understanding. Are you suggesting there might be patterns worth investigating? I believe data speaks for itself. If one were to compare parole hearing schedules against, say, inmate behavior reports or special program participation, that would require access to records the prison might be reluctant to share. Not if they're part of a legitimate legal inquiry. Teach's voice remained steady. An attorney might have grounds to request such documentation for pattern analysis. Davis nodded slowly. I'll look into that avenue. It could strengthen certain arguments we're developing. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a legal pad. Why don't you write down any specific observations that might help direct my research? As Teach began writing, he maintained a casual conversation about his appeal prospects. Meanwhile, his pen recorded a meticulously documented list of inmates whose parole trajectories defied explanation. Those advanced years ahead of schedule, and those repeatedly denied despite perfect records. Beside each name, he noted their relationship to prison informant programs, religious participation under Wickers or special assignments under Kincaid. When he finished, Davis reviewed the notes with a practiced neutral expression. This is comprehensive. I've had 3 years to observe patterns, Teach replied simply. Our time's almost up, Davis said, gathering her materials. I'll file the additional motions we discussed and follow up on these research questions. She rose, tucking the legal pad into her briefcase. Try to stay focused on your own case, Mr. Ramsey. The system works slowly, but it does work. For the benefit of listening ears, the platitude was perfect. For Teach, the determined glint in her eyes told a different story. 3 days later, a ripple of tension spread through the prison cafeteria. Inmates huddled in small groups, voices lowered, occasionally glancing toward the guards stationed along the perimeter. Something had changed in the atmosphere, a current of agitation running beneath the surface routine. At Teach's table, Martinez slid onto the bench, keeping his head down as he picked at his tray of unidentifiable stew. You hear about the memo? He murmured, not looking up. Teach continued eating methodically. What memo? Someone got hold of parole board documents. They're saying Turner got his hearing moved up because he's been feeding Kincaid information for months. Names, dates, everything. Martinez pushed his tray away. Paperwork shows at least a dozen guys who got early hearings after they started working with the administration. Where did this information come from? Teach asked. Nobody knows for sure. Started circulating last night. Jefferson and B Block had a copy, then Williams, then it was everywhere. Martinez leaned closer. They say it's official paperwork, has the warden's signature and everything. Across the cafeteria, C.O. Gentry watched the unusual activity from his post by the door. The controlled chaos of mealtime had a different tenor today. Too many furtive conversations, too many tense shoulders and darting eyes. Kincaid entered, immediately sensing the change. He strode directly to Gentry's position. Something's going on, he stated flatly. Yes, sir, Gentry agreed. Started about an hour ago, some kind of rumor spreading. Not just a rumor. Kincaid's face was tight with anger. Someone leaked internal documents about parole scheduling. They're circulating through the blocks. What kind of documents? The kind that make it clear who benefits from cooperation. Kincaid scanned the room, his gaze settling on Teach's table. This has Ramsey written all over it, but I can't figure out how he got access or how he's distributing them. As if feeling their scrutiny, Teach looked up, meeting their gaze with maddening calm before returning to his conversation. I want a sweep of every cell in his block, Kincaid ordered. Every book, every paper, every hiding place, and I want him in interrogation after lunch. The interrogation room was deliberately austere. A metal table bolted to the floor, 3 uncomfortable chairs, and a mirrored window for observation. No clock, no windows, nothing to anchor a person to time or place. Teach sat with perfect posture, hands folded on the table as Kincaid paced around him. Over 30 copies recovered so far, Kincaid said. Parole board schedules, internal memos, confidential informant documentation, all somehow extracted from secure files and distributed throughout the prison population. He stopped behind Teach, Dangerous game, stirring up the general population with half-truths. I wouldn't know anything about that, Teach replied mildly. Really? The same week your attorney visits? Confidential documents start circulating? Kincaid leaned down, his mouth close to Teach's ear. You think you're untouchable because you never get your hands dirty. Always the puppet master, never the puppet. Or perhaps I'm just another inmate focused on serving my time. Kincaid slammed his palm against the table. Cut the act. You were a nobody when you came in here. A disgraced teacher caught selling poison to children. Now half the inmates look to you for guidance, and it's not because of your literary insights. Maybe they're just hungry for education. They're hungry for what every prisoner wants: power, control, a way to fight the system. Kincaid moved to face him across the table. Where are the original documents? I don't have any documents. Your cell was clean. Too clean. Which means you've got a hiding place or accomplices. Kincaid's eyes narrowed. Is it Gentry? Has he been passing information? Teach's expression remained neutral. Officer Gentry has always conducted himself professionally. Perhaps your security issues lie elsewhere. The interrogation continued for 2 hours. Kincaid alternated between threats, false promises, and psychological tactics, all met with the same impassive responses. Finally, frustrated and no closer to a confession, he ordered Teach returned to his cell. This isn't over, Kincaid promised as guards escorted Teach to the door. One way or another, I'll find your weakness. We all have weaknesses, Sergeant, Teach replied. The question is whether we recognize them before they're exploited. That evening, Chaplain Wickers stood before an unusually large congregation in the chapel. Word had spread that his sermon would address the dangerous rumors circulating through the prison, and inmates packed the rows, tension crackling in the air like static electricity. Brothers, Wickers began, his voice pitched for maximum gravity. We gather today to address the poison of false witness that has infected our community. Proverbs tells us that a false witness will not go unpunished, and one who breathes out lies will perish. He paced the stage, Bible clutched dramatically to his chest. Some among you have been circulating malicious untruths about our parole system, a system designed to reward genuine rehabilitation and sincere moral improvement. A murmur rippled through the congregation. Wickers raised his voice to speak over it. Let me be clear. Participation in faith-based programs, cooperation with prison authorities, and demonstrating a commitment to order are all legitimate factors in parole consideration. His face flushed with indignation. Those who would twist this truth to sow discord are not just breaking prison rules, they're violating divine commandment. From his seat in the middle row, Teach watched the reactions around him. Some inmates nodded along, particularly those known to be in Wickers' inner circle. Others sat with tightly crossed arms, skepticism evident in their posture. The dividing lines were becoming clearer by the minute. False promises lead only to ruin, Wickers continued, building to his rhetorical climax. Trust in the established path, trust in legitimate authority, trust, like Turner trusted you? The interruption came from the back of the room. Washington, standing from his seat. He snitched on half of D Block because you promised him early release. Now we see his name on that parole list while better men rot. Guards moved immediately toward Washington, but before they could reach him, another voice called out. What? About Jenkins' medication? That part of your legitimate authority too? This from an older white inmate Teach recognized from the education program. Wickers sputtered. This is outrageous. These disruptions only prove... Prove what? A third voice joined in. That we can read? That we notice when the same names keep jumping the line while the rest of us follow your rules and get nothing? The chapel erupted into shouts and arguments. Guards rushed in from the sides, batons drawn. Wickers frantically called for order, as inmates rose from their seats, some moving toward the exits, others forming protective clusters. Through the chaos, Teach remained seated, watching as the carefully maintained facade of Coldwater's spiritual rehabilitation program fractured along the fault lines he had identified. The paper had done its work, not just exposing the truth of the parole system, but revealing who would defend that system even when its corruption was laid bare. C.O. Gentry stood outside the infirmary, clipboard in hand, reviewing the daily medication log. 3 days on tower duty had given him distance from the main prison population, but it had also provided perspective, a broader view of Coldwater's operations that had only deepened his unease. Dr. Winters emerged from the treatment room, looking harried. "Officer Gentry, they said you needed the updated restricted medications list." "Yes, ma'am. Just routine verification." Gentry glanced at the clipboard. "I noticed Jenkins from D Block hasn't received his heart medication for almost 2 weeks. Says here it's pending approval." Dr. Winters frowned, lowering her voice. "Between us, there's nothing pending. His medication was approved months ago, but I keep getting overridden by administration." "Overridden? On medical necessity?" "Welcome to Coldwater," she replied bitterly, "where even healthcare is a bargaining chip." She glanced around before continuing. "Jenkins isn't the only one. Anyone who's seen as uncooperative suddenly develops documentation issues with their prescriptions." Gentry processed this information, thinking of Jenkins' pallor, his labored breathing during yard time. "That's not just unethical, it's criminal?" Winters finished for him. "You won't last long here thinking like that, officer." She softened slightly at his expression. "Look, I've documented everything properly, filed the appropriate protests through medical channels, but Warden Draper signs my checks and Kincaid controls who I treat and when. What happens if someone has a medical emergency because of withheld medication? Then I treat them after it's too late to prevent damage." She took the clipboard from him, adding her signature to the form. "The system works exactly as designed, not for patient care but for control." As Winters returned to her office, Gentry remained in the corridor, troubled by this confirmation of his growing suspicions. After a moment's hesitation, he pulled a small notebook from his pocket and made a quick entry. Date, time, and details of the conversation. It joined a growing list of similar notations he'd been making since the incident with Washington. He was still writing when Kincaid rounded the corner, expression dark. "Gentry, what are you doing here? You're assigned to tower duty." "Shift change, sir. Was asked to drop off the medication verification forms." Kincaid's eyes dropped to the opuses. "What's that?" Gentry tucked it away quickly. "Just personal notes, sir, keeping track of my shifts." "Let me see it." "It's nothing official, sir, just—" "That wasn't a request, officer." Kincaid held out his hand. Reluctantly, Gentry surrendered the notebook. Kincaid flipped through it, his expression hardening as he read the documented incidents, dates, times, names, violations of procedure. "You've been keeping a record." Kincaid's voice was dangerously quiet. "Of what exactly? Building a case?" "No, sir. Just trying to keep things straight. There's a lot to learn." "This looks more like evidence gathering than learning." Kincaid pocketed the notebook. "Report to Warden Draper's office tomorrow morning. We'll discuss your future at Coldwater." He stepped closer. "And Gentry, if I find out you've been sharing any of these observations with inmates or outside parties, you'll face more than administrative discipline." As Kincaid walked away, Gentry leaned against the wall, the weight of what he'd done, what he'd risked, finally sinking in. He had a wife, a 2-year-old daughter, a mortgage, and now potentially no job. But he also had copies. Every entry in that notebook had been duplicated in a second journal hidden at home. The question was whether he had the courage to use it. The yard the following day was a powder keg. News of the chapel disruption had spread through the prison, along with rumors of punitive transfers for the inmates who had spoken out. Guards stood in tighter formations than usual, hands resting on their weapons, eyes constantly scanning for trouble. Teach sat at his usual table, apparently absorbed in a book, while actually monitoring the shifting dynamics across the yard. The leaked documents had accomplished what months of quiet conversations could not. They had made visible the invisible system of rewards and punishments that kept inmates divided and compliant. He was so focused on observing others that he almost missed the approach of 3 men from the far side of the yard, members of Smoke's former crew, moving with deliberate purpose toward his table. "Holloway wants a word," the leader announced, not sitting down. "Now." Teach marked his place in the book and stood unhurriedly. "Lead the way." They escorted him to a corner of the yard where Smoke stood with his back to the fence, surrounded by 6 other men, his inner circle. Their posture was protective, territorial, a clear message to anyone watching. This was gang business. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Teach," Smoke said without preamble. "Half the prison's ready to riot, the other half scrambling to protect their arrangements with administration." "Information has that effect," Teach replied. "It clarifies where people stand. It also paints targets on backs. Turner's been moved to protective custody. Martinez got jumped in the showers this morning. Wickers is naming names in his reports to the warden." Smoke stepped closer. "This ain't your classroom anymore. This is survival. And that's why you called me over? To warn me about the consequences of my actions?" "I called you over because my crew wants to know where I stand." Smoke gestured to the men around them. "They see me talking to you, sitting in your reading groups, walking away from fights. They're wondering if I've gone soft or if I'm playing a longer game." The men around them shifted, tension evident in their stance. This wasn't just a conversation. It was a test, for both Smoke and Teach. "And what have you told them?" Teach asked. "That you've got a plan, that all this—" Smoke waved his hand vaguely. "Book talk and Bible study is laying groundwork for something bigger." His eyes narrowed. "But they want details, Teach. They want to know what they're risking their necks for." One of the men stepped forward, Davis, Smoke's second in command and a notorious hardliner. "We respect Smoke, but this philosophical bullshit ain't protecting anyone. If Kincaid's coming down, we need to be ready to hit back, not hide behind books." "Violence is exactly what they expect," Teach responded calmly. "It's what the system is designed to absorb and use against us. Every riot, every fight, every assault just justifies more repression, more isolation, more control." "So what's your alternative?" Davis demanded. "Words? Papers? Prayers?" "Exposure," Teach said simply. "This prison operates in darkness. Kincaid, Wickers, Draper, they maintain power by controlling what information reaches the outside world, by determining whose story gets told and whose doesn't. And those papers going around, that your work?" Teach neither confirmed nor denied. "Those documents are just the beginning. Think about it. If the parole system is corrupt, what else is happening that we don't see? Medical neglect as coercion, falsified incident reports, orchestrated violence?" Several men nodded, recognition dawning in their expressions. "Every inmate in here has experienced some form of targeted injustice," Teach continued. "But we're told it's just us, just our bad luck or bad behavior. What happens when those individual experiences become a documented pattern? When evidence reaches the right people on the outside?" Davis remained skeptical. "The right people? You think anyone out there gives a damn about what happens to us? I think the state pays Coldwater millions to rehabilitate prisoners, not torture them. I think investors care about liability and public relations. I think journalists care about corruption and abuse of power." Teach's voice remained calm, but intensified in conviction. "But most importantly, I think we outnumber them 20-1. If we move as one body instead of divided factions, they can't control us all." A tense silence followed. The men exchanged glances, weighing his words against their instincts for self-preservation. Smoke watched them carefully, his own allegiance clearly hanging in the balance. Finally, Smoke turned to Teach. "If we back your play, we need skin in the game. Real influence, not just following orders." "This isn't about following orders," Teach replied. "It's about recognizing our common interest. You already have influence, your networks, your respect. I'm just suggesting we direct that influence toward strategic goals instead of tactical reactions." Smoke considered this, then nodded slowly. "All right, Teach. We'll see where this goes." He turned to his crew. "For now, we work with Ramsey. Spread the word. Anyone with documentation of Abuse, medical neglect, falsified reports, anything that shows the system is rigged gets it to us. Quietly. The men dispersed, leaving Smoke and Teach alone by the fence. "You just put yourself on the line for me," Teach observed. "For us," Smoke corrected. "Don't make me regret it." He glanced toward the administration building where Kincaid could be seen watching the yard from a second-floor window. "Because if this fails, we'll be the first ones they come for." Warden Draper's office had taken on a crisis command atmosphere. Kincaid stood rigidly before the desk, while Wickers paced nervously behind him. Draper himself sat reviewing incident reports, his expression growing darker with each page. 3 separate disruptions in 24 hours, he summarized, looking up at Kincaid. A near riot in the chapel. Contraband documents in every block. Inmate Washington hospitalized after reportedly falling in the shower. He dropped the papers on his desk. "And now I've got the State Oversight Committee calling about allegations of parole irregularities. Please tell me you have this under control." "We've identified the source of the leak," Kincaid reported. "The documents came through legal mail, specifically communication between Ramsey and his attorney." "You're monitoring privileged legal correspondence?" Draper's eyebrows shot up. "That's a lawsuit waiting to happen." "We're monitoring everything, as authorized by your security protocols," Kincaid replied defensively. "The question is what to do about Ramsey." "Transfer him," Wickers suggested immediately. "Send him to state. Let him be someone else's problem." Draper shook his head. "Too late for that. Transfer now would only validate whatever claims his attorney is preparing. We'd be handing them evidence of retaliation." "Then put him in solitary," Kincaid urged. "Maximum isolation. Cut off his ability to communicate." "On what grounds? He hasn't violated any rules personally. Everything points to him, but there's no direct evidence." Draper's pragmatic caution was evident in his tone. "We isolate him without cause, his attorney files for emergency relief, and suddenly we've got a judge poking around." "So we do nothing?" Kincaid's frustration boiled over. "Let him continue undermining everything we've built here?" "I didn't say that." Draper leaned forward. "What I'm saying is we need to be smarter than he is. Contain the situation legally, procedurally." He turned to Wickers. "The chapel incident, were any injuries reported?" "No serious ones," Wickers answered. "Some pushing and shoving. Guards restored order quickly." "Good. Then as of now, Coldwater is on modified lockdown due to security concerns. Restricted movement, increased surveillance, limited gatherings." Draper turned back to Kincaid. "All educational and religious programming is suspended pending security review." "That cuts off his platforms," Kincaid nodded approvingly. "Precisely. No classroom, no chapel, no yard congregation. Meals in shifts, with assigned seating." Draper began writing notes. "And I want you to rotate the guards, break up any relationships that might have formed between staff and inmates. Starting with Officer Gentry." "Gentry's been keeping records," Kincaid reported, producing the confiscated notebook. "Documenting procedural violations, alleged abuse. I found this on him today." Draper examined the notebook with a deepening frown. "Is he working with Ramsey?" "Unclear, but he's definitely compromised. Showing too much sympathy for the inmates, questioning procedures." After a moment's consideration, Draper made a decision. "Suspend him pending review. Full security protocol. Surrender his credentials, escort him out, no contact with current personnel." "And Ramsey?" Kincaid pressed. "For now we watch and wait. Cut off his resources, his audience, his influence. Isolate him without giving him legal grounds to fight back." Draper's expression hardened. "And Kincaid? Find concrete evidence linking him to these disruptions. Something that will justify more permanent measures." "Yes, sir." As Kincaid and Wickers left the office, alarms began blaring throughout the prison, the signal for immediate lockdown. Throughout the facility, guards began herding inmates back to their cells, securing common areas, and establishing control points at key junctures. In his cell, Teach listened to the mechanical sound of doors locking, the shouted orders echoing down the corridors, the methodical reassertion of institutional control. He had expected this response. It was the predictable move in the institutional playbook. But predictability could be leveraged. While the administration focused on containment, on shutting down visible avenues of communication, the unseen networks he had been cultivating for months would continue to function. Messages passed through kitchen workers, information exchanged during mandated medical checks, documentation collected and concealed. The papers had done their work, exposing the truth, yes, but more importantly, forcing the administration to react, to overreach, to reveal their own vulnerabilities in their desperate grab for control. The lockdown would be oppressive, the retaliation would be severe, but the fire had been lit, a fire of awareness, of solidarity, of resistance. And now, even as they tried to smother it, that fire would find new paths, new fuel, new air. Teach sat on his bunk, closed his eyes, and began mentally preparing for the next phase, one where strategy would need to shift from building influence to surviving isolation. From visible leadership to invisible orchestration. They thought they were containing him. In reality, they were only proving his point, that the system's true nature emerged not in its routine operations, but in its desperate defense of its own contradictions. Solitary confinement at Coldwater was a concrete box measuring 8 by 10 feet, a space designed to break both body and spirit. No windows, a solid steel door with a small slot for food trays, and 23 hours a day of absolute isolation. The single hour of recreation consisted of pacing alone in a slightly larger cage outdoors, regardless of weather. Teach had been in the hole for 5 days. The official reason: precautionary administrative segregation during facility security review. No charges, no hearing, no due process, just Kincaid and 2 guards appearing at his cell during the lockdown's 3rd day, escorting him to this box where time stretched and compressed like taffy. He sat cross-legged on the thin mattress, eyes closed, breath measured. 3 years in Coldwater had prepared him for this moment, the inevitable isolation that came when power felt threatened. While some men broke within days, clawing at walls, or screaming into the void, Teach had trained his mind differently. Every morning he mentally walked the corridors of his former school in Detroit, greeting students by name, recalling faces, voices, lessons. Every afternoon he recited poetry from memory: Langston Hughes, Maya Angelou, Paul Laurence Dunbar, their rhythms keeping his thoughts ordered. Every evening he reviewed his mental map of Coldwater, the networks established, the allies positioned, the groundwork laid. The lights in solitary never fully dimmed, part of the disorientation strategy. But in the deep hours when the corridor outside fell quietest, Teach reached under his mattress for his most precious contraband, the spine of his confiscated Bible, hollowed out, containing a stub of pencil and scraps of paper he'd managed to conceal during processing. By the faint perpetual light he wrote, tiny, precise notes documenting each day, each guard rotation, each procedural violation. Information was survival. Information was resistance. Information was power. A sound at the door, the small viewing slot sliding open. Teach quickly tucked the writing materials away, resuming his meditation posture. Still playing Malik Ramsey? Kincaid's voice came through the opening, followed by his face appearing in the narrow rectangle. Most men are climbing the walls by now. Teach opened his eyes. Perhaps I'm not most men. That's your problem, thinking you're special. But in here, you're just another number. No audience, no followers, no one listening to your philosophical bullshit. And yet you're here listening. Kincaid's expression hardened. I'm here to let you know your little revolution is finished. Your reading group's been permanently dissolved. Your attorney's visitation privileges have been suspended pending investigation into contraband transmission. And Holloway's been transferred to East Block. Teach absorbed this information without visible reaction. Though the news about smoke concerned him, East Block was where Coldwater housed its most volatile inmates. those deemed management problems or security risks. Nothing to say? Kincaid prodded. No wise quotes? No righteous indignation? Would it matter if there were? You still don't get it, do you? Kincaid's voice lowered. This isn't about rehabilitation or justice or any of those pretty words. This is about control. The only difference between you and me is that I acknowledge the reality of the system, while you pretend there's some moral high ground. Perhaps the difference is that I believe systems can change. Kincaid laughed. Systems don't change. They evolve to protect themselves. Right now, Warden Draper is on a conference call with state officials explaining how recent security incidents demonstrate the need for expanded funding, enhanced restrictions, and extended sentences for troublemakers. He stepped back from the viewing slot. You'll be in here for at least 30 days. By the time you get out, if you get out, whatever momentum you built will be gone. That's how the system wins. Not by fighting ideas, but by isolating them until they suffocate. After Kincaid left, Teach remained motionless for several minutes, processing the implications. 30 days was longer than expected, but not insurmountable. The key information was Smoke's transfer and Davis's suspension, moves designed to sever his most important connections. What Kincaid didn't realize was that isolation had always been part of the calculation. Every resistance movement reached this phase, the moment when visible leadership was removed, forcing the network to function independently. The question now was whether the foundations were strong enough to withstand the pressure. C.O. Brian Gentry sat in his car outside the county courthouse, drumming his fingers nervously on the steering wheel. 2 weeks had passed since his suspension from Coldwater. 2 weeks of anxious nights, tense conversations with his wife about finances and increasingly desperate job applications. And now this, a text message from an unknown number. County Courthouse, 2 p.m., South Entrance. Bring your records. YD. He checked his watch. 1:55 p.m. In the passenger seat lay a manila envelope containing his second notebook, the backup he'd kept at home, documenting everything from Washington's staged fight to Jenkins's withheld medication. At precisely, Trussier, a silver Audi pulled alongside his car. The passenger window rolled down, revealing Yvette Davis in the driver's seat. "Mr. Gentry," she called, "why don't you join me?" Heart pounding, he grabbed the envelope and slid into her car. "I appreciate you coming," Davis said, pulling away from the curb. "I know it's a risk." "How did you get my number?" Gentry asked. "Let's just say Mr. Ramsey keeps excellent mental records." She drove several blocks before continuing. "I understand you've been documenting irregularities at Coldwater." Gentry clutched the envelope tighter. "That's why I was suspended. Kincaid found my notebook. But not all your records." "No." He hesitated. "What exactly is happening here? Am I talking to Ramsey's lawyer or—" "Today you're talking to a civil rights attorney building a class action lawsuit against Coldwater Correctional Enterprises." Davis turned onto a quiet side street and parked. "And I believe your evidence could be critical to that case. They'll know it came from me. I'll never work in corrections again." "That's likely true," Davis acknowledged. "The question is whether that matters more than what's happening inside those walls." Gentry stared at the envelope. 3 years of his life invested in a career now hanging by a thread. A mortgage, a child. Stability sacrificed for what? The moral high ground? "Ramsey," he said finally. "Is he okay?" "Solitary confinement. Minimum 30 days, potentially longer. No charges filed." "And Jenkins? The older guy with the heart condition?" "His name is on my list of medical neglect cases. I haven't been allowed to verify his current status." Gentry made his decision, handing over the envelope. "Everything's dated, witnessed, names included. It's not just isolated incidents, it's systematic. The fight setups, the medical coercion, the informant rewards, it's all by design." Davis accepted the envelope with a nod. "This could make a difference, Mr. Gentry." not just for individual inmates, but for the entire system. What happens now? Now, Davis said, starting the car. I add your documentation to our filing. Next week, we present to a federal judge requesting institutional oversight and an immediate investigation. She glanced at him. And you decide what kind of future you want to build from here. As Gentry stepped out of the car, Davis added, If you're called to testify, will you? He thought of Jenkins struggling to breathe, of Washington pinned under, Kincaid's boot, of the fear that permeated Coldwater's walls like the smell of industrial disinfectant. Yes, he said simply. I'll testify. In the East Block Yard, a smaller, more heavily guarded exercise area reserved for high-risk inmates, Smoke leaned against the fence, watching the new faces around him. Most kept their distance, recognizing a power player when they saw one, even in unfamiliar territory. A stocky man with prison-inked tears beneath his right eye approached. Holloway, word is you were running things in general before they moved you over. Smoke sized him up. Muscle built from years of prison workouts, eyes that calculated threat levels with practiced efficiency. Just taking care of my people, Smoke replied neutrally. That include Ramsey? Heard you two got tight. I work with whoever advances my interests. The man nodded. Name's Wilson. I run the kitchen detail here. Good place for information to flow. He lowered his voice. Got a message for you. Prayer chain's still active. Doc's watching Jenkins. Gentry met with the lawyer. Smoke kept his expression neutral, though the coded update confirmed what he'd hoped. The networks Teach had established were still functioning despite the lockdown and transfers. Any response? Wilson asked. Smoke considered carefully. Without Teach's direct guidance, he needed to make strategic decisions that would maintain momentum without triggering further crackdowns. Tell them to document everything. Every denied medication, every skipped meal, every accident in the showers. No retaliation, no matter what. Wilson looked skeptical. Just watch and record? That's the big plan? For now, Smoke confirmed, building the case that brings the walls down. As Wilson walked away, Smoke gazed up at the guard towers surrounding the yard. In his former life, his instinct would have been to fight force with force, to respond to Kincaid's oppression with violence that would ultimately be used to justify even greater control. Teach had shown him a different path, one that required more discipline, more patience, but offered the possibility of actual change rather than merely symbolic resistance. The question was whether that path could survive without its architect. The door to solitary swung open at midnight on Teach's 12th day of isolation. Two guards he didn't recognize stood in the corridor. On your feet, Ramsey, hands on the wall. Teach complied, mind racing. Midnight transfers typically meant one of two things, either a move to another facility without warning, or an off-the-books session with officers looking to administer extrajudicial punishment. They cuffed his hands behind his back and escorted him down the corridor, not toward the processing area but deeper into the restricted section of Coldwater. His heart sank. This was the scenario he'd feared most, Kincaid taking matters into his own hands, away from cameras or witnesses. They stopped at a windowless room at the end of the hall. One guard unlocked the door, while the other maintained a grip on Teach's arm. Your attorney pulled some strings, the first guard muttered, in 10 minutes. They pushed him inside, where a figure waited in shadow. Not Kincaid, but Yvette Davis. Mr. Ramsey, she said formally, aware of the guards just outside. I've been granted emergency legal visitation due to developments in your case. When the door closed, she moved quickly to him, speaking in a whisper. Listen carefully. We don't have much time. The federal filing happens tomorrow, class action on behalf of 37 inmates, including you. Medical neglect, civil rights violations, abuse of power. Gentry came through, Teach observed, quietly. Yes, and we have more. 3 former guards, 2 medical staff, documentation going back 5 years. She helped him sit, his hands still cuffed behind him. But there's a problem. Warden Draper got wind of the filing. There are rumors of transfers, record adjustments, potential witness tampering. Smoke? Still in East Block, but isolated. Jenkins is in the infirmary. Alleged suicide attempt, though our sources say it was a staged incident to discredit his testimony. Teach absorbed this information, calculating implications. They're covering tracks, silencing potential witnesses. Exactly. The judge might order institutional monitoring, but not for at least 72 hours. Until then, she left the sentence unfinished. 3 days is a lifetime in here, Teach finished for her, especially when the system feels threatened. I tried to get you transferred to protective custody, but Kincaid blocked it, claimed you were safer in isolation. He's not wrong, Teach said grimly. Solo targets are harder to explain away than group incidents. Davis leaned closer. What do you need me to do? Get word to Smoke. Tell him it's time for the second phase, visible non-compliance. Nothing violent, nothing destructive, just synchronized stoppage. What does that mean? He'll understand. Teach shifted uncomfortably in the cuffs. And Davis? When you see the judge tomorrow, make sure they understand this isn't just about conditions or abuses. It's about a business model built on human suffering. The door opened, signaling the end of their time. Courage, Mr. Ramsey, Davis said loudly for the benefit of the guards. The legal system may move slowly, but justice does come. Back in his cell, Teach carefully extracted his hidden writing materials and added new entries based on Davis's information. The next 72 hours would be critical, a dangerous window when the administration would be scrambling to undermine the legal challenge by any means necessary. He had always known this moment would come. The question now was whether the foundation he'd built, the networks of trust, the shared understanding of strategic resistance, could withstand the storm that was about to break over Coldwater. As he concealed his notes once more, Teach prepared himself mentally for what might come. Intensified isolation, possible transfer, even accidents arranged to silence him permanently. The system, as Kincaid had said, evolved to protect itself, but systems comprised people, and people, unlike systems, could change, could choose differently when shown the full reality of their participation in oppression. That had always been the core of his strategy, not just exposing Coldwater's abuses to outside authorities, but revealing to those within its walls, inmates and staff alike, the nature of the machine they were part of. The next 3 days would test that strategy to its limits. Coldwater's chapel gleamed under hastily installed additional lighting. Maintenance staff had worked through the night, painting over water stains, replacing broken chairs, and erecting a temporary backdrop behind the pulpit emblazoned with the facility's motto, rehabilitation through structure and faith. Today was no ordinary service. 3 state officials, a journalist from the Mississippi Observer, and representatives from the prison's corporate ownership group sat in a reserved front row. Behind them, inmates filed in under heavy guard, their movements restricted to designated seating areas separated by security staff. Warden Draper stood near the entrance, greeting visitors with practiced cordiality while simultaneously directing guards with subtle hand signals. Public relations damage control was in full swing, a hastily organized demonstration of Coldwater's nationally recognized faith-based rehabilitation program in response to rumors of the impending lawsuit. Chaplain Wickers bustled about in his finest suit, arranging his materials on the pulpit with theatrical precision. This is our opportunity to showcase the transformative power of our ministry, he instructed the inmate choir members. Remember, genuine expressions of gratitude for the program. Authentic, but appropriate. 24 days into his solitary confinement, Teach had been surprised by the arrival of guards at his cell that morning. You're needed for the chapel service, they'd announced, providing no further explanation as they escorted him to a shower and issued him a freshly pressed uniform. Now he sat in the second row, directly in the official's line of sight. A strategic placement he recognized immediately. Visual evidence of Coldwater's humane treatment of the very inmate rumored to be at the center of complaints. Smoke was notably absent, So was any guard who might have witnessed previous disruptions. This was a carefully curated presentation. Wickers approached the pulpit, beaming at the assembled visitors. Distinguished guests, thank you for joining our special service today. At Coldwater, we believe true rehabilitation begins with moral and spiritual transformation. He gestured expansively. What you'll witness isn't just religious programming. It's the restoration of human dignity and purpose. From his seat, Teach observed the officials' polite but skeptical expressions. The journalist scribbled occasional notes, eyes scanning the room with professional suspicion. They hadn't come for reassurance. They'd come to evaluate the allegations already, filtering through official channels. Today's theme is redemption through acceptance, Wickers continued. We're blessed to have an inmate testimony that powerfully demonstrates this principle. His gaze fixed on Teach with barely disguised warning. Brother Ramsey, a participant in our advanced spiritual mentorship program, will share a reflection on forgiveness and justice. The invitation wasn't spontaneous, it was calculated risk management. By giving Teach a supervised platform, they positioned themselves as transparent while controlling the environment. Any disruption would only validate their security concerns. Any criticism would appear ungrateful. Guards flanked Teach as he approached the pulpit. Kincaid watched from the side entrance, hand resting on his baton. Thank you, Chaplain Wickers. Teach began, his voice steady despite weeks of isolation. And thank you to our visitors for taking interest in our spiritual journey. He paused, scanning the audience. In the back rows, he recognized faces from his reading group, the prayer circle, inmates who had quietly joined the resistance. Their subtle nods communicated that despite the lockdown, the network remained intact. When I consider justice and forgiveness, Teach continued, I'm drawn to an ancient parable about a servant who, having been forgiven a great debt by his master, refuses to forgive a fellow servant a much smaller debt. Wickers nodded approvingly, relaxing slightly at this conventional opening. The parable teaches that mercy should flow from those who have received mercy, Teach said. But it also reveals something profound about systems of debt and power. His voice took on a resonant quality that filled the chapel. The servant wasn't cruel because he was inherently evil. He was cruel because he operated within a system that taught him cruelty, that normalized the exploitation of vulnerability. Wickers shifted uncomfortably as Teach continued. True rehabilitation isn't just about changing individual hearts. It's about recognizing broken systems. Teach's gaze moved deliberately to the officials. When medication becomes leverage instead of treatment, when violence is orchestrated rather than prevented, when advancement depends on betrayal rather than growth, the system itself requires redemption. The journalist's pen moved faster. State officials exchanged glances. I've been blessed with time for reflection recently, Teach said, the irony of describing solitary confinement as a blessing not lost on the inmates. 24 days of contemplating what justice truly means, and I've concluded that justice without transparency is merely power. Rehabilitation without dignity is merely submission. Wickers stepped forward, clearly intending to intervene, but Teach smoothly pivoted. That's why I'm grateful for Chaplain Wickers in this program. The words were right, but the emphasis carried a different message entirely. They've shown us exactly how spiritual guidance functions within these walls. They've demonstrated precisely what redemption means at Coldwater. He turned to face the inmates directly. Brothers, remember this truth. Even in the belly of the beast, your story matters. Your witness matters. Your silence or your speech both have power. The subtext rippled through the room. Inmates who had been coached to appear passive now sat straighter, eyes alert. The resistance wasn't broken. It had simply moved underground, waiting for this moment of visibility. I'll close with words that have sustained me, Teach said. From the prophet Micah, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly? May we all, inmates, officers, administrators, and honored guests, reflect on whether justice is truly being done within these walls. As Teach returned to his seat, The chapel remained unnervingly silent. The expected applause didn't materialize. Instead, a palpable tension hung in the air. The collective recognition that what they'd witnessed wasn't the testimonial Wickers had promised, but something far more dangerous. Truth spoken in a room designed for carefully constructed narratives. The journalist was writing furiously now. The state officials whispered among themselves. Warden Draper's face had darkened considerably. Wickers hurried to reclaim control, launching into a hymn selection. But the damage was done. Through carefully chosen words that couldn't be labeled as disruptive or disrespectful, Teach had transformed their publicity stunt into exactly what they feared, a platform for legitimate grievances witnessed by people with the power to act on them. 2 hours later, in a cramped office adjacent to the chapel, Kincaid paced while Draper attempted damage control with the state officials. Ramsey clearly manipulated the opportunity, Kincaid insisted. Every word was calculated to undermine our authority. He quoted scripture and spoke about justice. Draper countered irritably. There was nothing explicitly insubordinate in his remarks. That journalist is already questioning why he's in solitary without charges. Because he's orchestrating resistance throughout the facility. Those weren't just religious platitudes, they were coded instructions. Did you see how the inmates responded? Before Draper could answer, a guard knocked and entered. Sir, there's a situation in East Block. Inmates are refusing to return to cells after lunch. They're just sitting there. No violence, no demands, just non-compliance. Draper and Kincaid exchanged alarmed looks. It's starting, Kincaid said grimly. Just like I warned you. This is Ramsey's influence. Contain it, Draper ordered. Isolation for the ringleaders, but minimal force. We've got too many outside eyes on us today. As the guard departed, Kincaid moved toward the door. And Ramsey? Back to solitary. Double the surveillance. No contact with anyone. Smoke was returning from the East Block yard when he saw Teach being escorted through the corridor, presumably back to isolation after the chapel service. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. What neither man saw was Kincaid observing the exchange from the control room. Minutes later, as Smoke lined up for afternoon count, Kincaid appeared with 4 officers in riot gear. Holloway, Kincaid called. Step out of line. Smoke complied cautiously. Something wrong, Sergeant? Contraband search. Hands against the wall. The other inmates watched warily as Smoke assumed the position. Kincaid approached, leaning close enough to whisper. I saw that look with Ramsey. You're carrying messages, aren't you? Don't know what you're talking about. The first blow came without warning, a baton strike to the kidney that sent Smoke crumpling to his knees. Kincaid delivered a second hit across the shoulders. Resisting search, Kincaid shouted, loud enough for the official record. Restrain him. The riot officers swarmed, pinning Smoke to the ground. One twisted his arm until a sickening pop echoed through the corridor. Through a haze of pain, Smoke registered the methodical nature of the assault, calculated damage with minimal visible marks. This is what happens to Ramsey's messengers, Kincaid hissed, delivering a final kick to Smoke's ribs. Take him to medical. Catalog his injuries as resistant during standard search procedure. As they dragged him away, Smoke caught the expressions of the other inmates. Not fear as Kincaid might have intended, but cold, silent witness. Dozens of eyes tracking every moment of the assault. Dozens of memories that couldn't be erased or reclassified. Kincaid had made a critical error. In his desperation to reassert control, he'd created exactly what Teach had been building toward. An undeniable demonstration of the system's true nature, witnessed collectively. Davis received the call from her informant within Coldwater's medical staff an hour later. Inmate Holloway's been admitted with multiple injuries, the voice reported quietly. Broken arm, 3 cracked ribs, internal bruising. The official report says he attacked officers during a search, but the medical evidence doesn't match that story. Are you willing to document that assessment? Davis asked, already adding notes to her case file. Already done. I've copied his intake forms in my examination notes. But there's something else. The chapel service this morning. Ramsey spoke, and it's got the administration rattled. Inmates are engaging in passive resistance across 3 blocks. Any recordings of his remarks? Better. The journalist took a complete transcript and shared it with several inmates after the service. I've got a copy. Get it to me immediately, Davis instructed. And make sure Holloway receives proper treatment. He's now a key witness. After ending the call, Davis contacted her legal team. File for an emergency injunction first thing tomorrow. Specific protection for Ramsey and Holloway, plus expedited discovery. We need a judge on site within 24 hours, not 72. The situation was accelerating faster than anticipated. What had begun as a carefully documented legal challenge was transforming into something more urgent, a real-time crisis that demanded immediate intervention. In his office, Warden Draper reviewed the IDI incident reports from East Block, his expression grim. This is becoming untenable, Ray. Peaceful non-compliance in 3 blocks, an injured inmate under suspicious circumstances, and state officials asking pointed questions about our operating procedures. We're containing the situation, Kincaid insisted. Are we? Because it looks to me like we're validating every accusation. Draper tossed the reports aside. The internal affairs officer wants to interview you about the Holloway incident. Standard procedure, which I've temporarily suspended. Draper's voice hardened. The optics are already bad enough. The last thing we need is an official investigation, confirming excessive force. Kincaid stared at him. You're blocking an investigation into my actions? I'm prioritizing institutional stability during a security crisis. The investigation will proceed after we've restored order. Draper leaned back in his chair. But Ray, unofficially? Get yourself under control. Your obsession with Ramsey is becoming a liability. He's turning the entire prison against us. No, you're doing that with every overreaction. Draper stood. Go home. Take 48 hours. I'll handle the situation from here. As Kincaid left, slamming the door behind him, Draper reached for his phone. The corporation had to be informed about the developing situation, preferably before they heard it from state officials or worse, the press. What none of them realized was that the system's response was becoming part of the evidence against it. Each defensive reaction further revealing the truth Teach had been methodically exposing all along. Davis's law office hummed with urgent activity. Associates huddled over documents spread across conference tables, organizing evidence into categories: medical neglect, excessive force, parole manipulation, falsified records. 3 decades of institutional abuse condensed into meticulously labeled folders. The pattern is undeniable, Davis explained to the federal inspector who'd arrived that morning. Coldwater doesn't just have isolated incidents of misconduct. It has a systematic practice of using basic human needs as leverage for control. She pulled up a spreadsheet on her laptop. This is a database we've compiled from medical records. Inmates who cooperated with administration, informants, religious program participants, those who stayed silent about abuses, received timely medication and treatment. Those who didn't. The inspector leaned forward, studying the stark statistical correlations. And you have documentation verifying these patterns? Internal records going back to 2004. Davis opened another file. Gentry's testimony provided the contemporary confirmation, but the roots go deeper. These records show identical patterns under 3 different wardens. It's not individual corruption, it's corporate policy. The corporation will claim these decisions were made by facility management without their knowledge, except we have their quarterly performance metrics. Davis slid forward a stack of spreadsheets. Note the bonuses tied to operational efficiency and resource management. They incentivized cutting corners on medical care, food quality, rehabilitation programs, anything that affected the bottom line. The inspector nodded grimly. This explains why they're suddenly attempting to transfer key witnesses. We've received word that Ramsey is scheduled for immediate relocation to the state facility upstate. That can't happen. Davis grabbed her phone. I'm filing for an emergency injunction right now. If Ramsey disappears into the state system, records will get lost, witnesses scattered. As she dialed, her assistant rushed in with a USB drive. "You need to see this, just came in from Gentry." Inside Coldwater, the noon meal service in Block D proceeded with unusual silence. Inmates filed through the line, accepted their trays, and moved to their assigned tables without the typical din of prison dining. Guards shifted nervously, sensing the abnormal quiet. At exactly 12:15, Teach set down his fork and sat motionless, hands folded on the table. Around him, one by one, other inmates did the same. No words, no signals, just synchronized stillness spreading table by table until half the cafeteria sat in silent protest. A guard approached Teach's table. "Problem with your food, Ramsey?" Teach didn't respond, his gaze focused straight ahead. "I asked you a question, inmate." Silence. The guard keyed his radio. "Potential disturbance in D Block cafeteria. Inmates refusing orders." Within minutes, the room filled with additional officers, batons ready. A lieutenant surveyed the scene, realizing the scope of the coordinated action. "Everyone return to your meal or return to your cells," he shouted. "This is your only warning." Not a single inmate moved. Not a word was spoken. Just silence. The most unsettling form of defiance. The same scene was playing out simultaneously in Blocks B and East. Hundreds of inmates, sitting motionless, refusing food, refusing orders, simply refusing. No violence, no property damage, no demands. Just withdrawal of cooperation on a massive scale. Kincaid stormed into Warden Draper's office without knocking. "We need lockdown procedures implemented immediately. The silent protest has spread to 3 blocks. Draper looked up wearily. "I thought I told you to take 48 hours. That was before this coordinated insubordination. They're following Ramsey's playbook. Nonviolent resistance designed to undermine authority while avoiding disciplinary response." Kincaid paced agitatedly. "We need to isolate the ringleaders." "And how do we identify them when no one's speaking?" Draper asked pointedly. "We can't put 300 inmates in solitary for sitting quietly. We start with Ramsey. Get him out of this facility today. The transfer paperwork is being processed, but..." Kincaid slammed his palm on the desk. Not fast enough. He needs to be gone before this escalates further." "Ray," Draper said carefully, "you need to consider your position here. The internal affairs investigation may be temporarily suspended, but the Holloway incident hasn't disappeared. The optics of force against nonviolent protest would be catastrophic. So we just surrender control of the prison? No. We manage the situation without creating additional liability." Draper hesitated, then continued reluctantly. "The corporate office called this morning. They're concerned about potential exposure from the pending lawsuit." "Of course they are," Kincaid sneered. "Always protecting the bottom line." "They've authorized a preemptive response," Draper continued, "including certain personnel adjustments." Kincaid stilled. "Meaning what?" "They're offering you a lateral transfer. Regional security coordinator for their facilities in Tennessee. Higher salary, administrative role, effective immediately." Draper slid a folder across the desk. "It's a good package, Ray. Clean exit before things get complicated." Kincaid stared at the folder without touching it. "They're hanging me out. To dry. They're offering a lifeline. Once the federal investigation begins in earnest, individual officers will become targets." Draper's voice softened slightly. "You've put in 17 years here. Take the promotion and walk away clean." For a moment, Kincaid seemed to consider it, his hand hovering over the folder. Then his expression hardened. This is exactly what Ramsey wants. The system turning on itself. He stepped back from the desk. "I'm not running, and I'm not letting him win." "Ray, be reasonable. I'm implementing emergency protocols in all blocks," Kincaid cut him off. "And I'm personally overseeing Ramsey's transfer tonight. With or without the paperwork." As Kincaid left, Draper stared at the closed door. Then he picked up the phone. "Get me the corporate office. We have a situation developing." In the silent cafeteria, the standoff continued. The lieutenant, increasingly desperate, keyed his radio again. "Sir, we need guidance. They're not responding to warnings." Kincaid's voice crackled back. "Use extraction teams. Target the known associates first. Jones, Martinez, Washington. Make examples." Guards moved in formation toward specific tables. The first inmate, Jones, was yanked from his seat and forced to the ground. Still, not a word, not a movement from the others. They seized Martinez next, twisting his arm behind his back. He winced but remained silent. As they approached Washington, a guard noticed something unusual, a small device partly concealed under his tray. A cell phone, its camera lens peeking, out, recording everything. "Contraband!" the guard shouted, grabbing for the phone. Too late. The recording had already been streaming to an external server for 18 minutes. Every takedown, every use of force against silent, non-resistant inmates, all captured and transmitted beyond Coldwater's walls. Davis burst into the judge's chambers, tablet in hand. "Your Honor, I have new evidence requiring immediate intervention." Judge Harriet Monroe looked up irritably. "Counselor, this is highly irregular." "As is this, Your Honor." Davis placed the tablet before her. "Live footage from inside Coldwater showing violent suppression of peaceful protest. This is happening right now." The judge watched the silent video of guards forcibly removing seated inmates. Her expression darkened. "How did you obtain this?" "That's not relevant to the emergency injunction request, Your Honor. What matters is that inmates exercising nonviolent protest are being physically assaulted, and your client, Ramsey, being prepared for immediate transfer. Despite our pending case, we've confirmed the transport vehicle is already at the facility." Judge Monroe studied the footage for another moment, then nodded decisively. "I'm granting the emergency injunction. No transfers of any named plaintiffs until this court reviews the full evidence." She reached for her phone. "And I'm ordering federal marshals to secure the facility pending investigation." Davis exhaled in relief. "Thank you, Your Honor." "Don't thank me yet, Counselor. If conditions are as you describe, this goes well beyond civil remedies. We may be looking at criminal charges for those responsible." Gentry sat in his car across from the local news station, heart pounding as he watched the reporter review the footage on his laptop. "This is extraordinary," the journalist said, eyes wide. "How did you get this inside access?" "I have contacts who believe the public deserves to know what's happening," Gentry replied carefully. "There's more. Documentation of systematic abuses, medical neglect, orchestrated violence. Why come to me instead of going through official channels?" "Official channels are compromised." Gentry handed over a USB drive. "This contains everything: my personal records, testimony from medical staff, documentation of the parole manipulation scheme. Coldwater isn't just a poorly run prison, it's a carefully designed system of exploitation." The reporter studied him. "You understand going public makes you a target?" "I've been a target since I started documenting the abuses." Gentry managed a grim smile. "At least now the truth will be heard." Teach sat in his solitary cell, listening to the increased activity in the corridor outside. Raised voices, hurried footsteps, the distinct sound of multiple radios crackling with urgent communications. Something had changed. The atmosphere had shifted from controlled tension to barely contained chaos. The door swung open abruptly. Kincaid stood there, 2 guards behind him. "Get up," he ordered. "Transfer orders. You're leaving Coldwater tonight." Teach noted the absence of paperwork, the agitated state of the guards, the sweat beading on Kincaid's forehead. "Where's the transfer documentation?" "You don't ask questions, you follow orders." "I believe I'm entitled to review transfer paperwork," Teach insisted calmly. "Standard procedure, Sergeant? Or is this another example of Coldwater's selective application of protocol?" Kincaid's face flushed with anger. "Cuff him," he snapped to the guards. "Resistance to transfer." As the guards hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the irregular procedure, an alarm began blaring throughout the facility. The second guard's radio squawked. "All officers return to posts immediately. Federal marshals on site. Repeat, Federal marshals on site with judicial orders. Kincaid froze, disbelief washing over his features. What? The radio continued. All prisoner transfers suspended by federal injunction. All staff to report for identification and preliminary statements. The guards exchanged nervous glances. Sir, one began tentatively. Maybe we should get out, Kincaid ordered, not taking his eyes off Teach. Both of you, secure the corridor. Sir, the marshals, out! As the guards retreated, closing the door behind them, Kincaid and Teach were left alone in the small concrete cell. This was always your endgame, Kincaid said, voice dangerously quiet. Turn the system against itself. Make them question everything we've built here. Not against itself, Teach corrected. Against corruption, against abuse, against the commodification of human suffering. Very poetic. Kincaid moved closer. But you've miscalculated. Federal investigations take time. Witnesses disappear. Evidence gets lost. The system protects its own. Not when the evidence is already public, Teach replied. Not when hundreds of inmates have witnessed the truth. Not when your own actions have proven everything we claimed. Something shifted in Kincaid's expression, a dangerous realization dawning. They're already inside the facility, aren't they? The marshals? Yes. But more importantly, the truth is already outside these walls. Teach met his gaze steadily. It's over, Sergeant. The only question is how you choose to end it. Kincaid's hand moved to his belt, fingers brushing his baton. For a moment, violence hung in the air between them, the last desperate act of a man whose control was slipping away. Then the corridor outside filled with authoritative voices, the sound of multiple boots approaching. Kincaid stepped back, his expression hardening into resignation. This isn't justice, he said finally. This is just a different kind of power play. Perhaps, Teach acknowledged. But it's a beginning, a chance to build something better from the ruins of what was broken. As the door opened again, revealing federal marshals instead of prison guards, Teach remained seated, hands folded calmly in his lap. The ledger of Coldwater's sins had finally been balanced, not through violence or vengeance, but through the patient, persistent exposure of truth. Midnight at Coldwater felt different. The usual oppressive silence was punctuated by unfamiliar movements, federal marshals conducting sweeps, administrative staff summoned for emergency interviews, corporate lawyers arriving in unmarked vehicles. Despite the late hour, the facility hummed with the energy of a system under siege. In the administrative corridor, Warden Draper sat surrounded by documentation, frantically reviewing files before federal investigators could seize them. His tie hung loose around his neck, his usual polished demeanor crumbling under pressure. 3 floors below in the medical unit, Smoke lay on a hospital bed, arm in a fresh cast, monitoring the unusual activity through his half-open door. When the night nurse stepped away, he eased himself up, wincing through the pain of his still-healing ribs. You shouldn't be moving, a voice cautioned from the doorway. Jenkins stood there, leaning on a cane, his own medical treatment finally, prioritized under federal scrutiny. Got somewhere to be, Smoke replied, pulling on a uniform shirt one painful sleeve at a time. Need to make a call. Jenkins glanced down the empty corridor, then handed Smoke a small flip phone. Guard dropped this during the commotion. Already activated. Smoke dialed a memorized number, speaking quickly when the line connected. It's happening tonight. West Corridor, Solitary Unit C. Kincaid's assembled a team outside normal rotation. In his isolated cell, Teach sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes closed but senses alert. He'd recognized the subtle shift in guard rotations, the unusual silence. In adjacent cells, the methodical preparation for an operation that wouldn't appear in any official log. He'd been expecting this, Kincaid's final desperate move. With federal marshals controlling the facility entrances but still establishing jurisdiction within the complex, a brief window of opportunity existed for accidents to befall key witnesses. Footsteps approached, multiple sets, moving with practiced coordination, not the steady rhythm of regular patrols or the authoritative stride of federal officers, but the deliberate stealth of men operating in shadows. Teach opened his eyes, facing the door. Whatever happened next, he would meet it with full awareness. The lock disengaged with a metallic click. The door swung open to reveal Kincaid flanked by 4 officers Teach had never seen before. Faces obscured by riot visors, no name tags, no identifying markers. "Extraction team," Kincaid announced flatly. Inmate reported suicidal ideation, moving to psychiatric observation. Teach remained seated. "I've made no such report." "Noted in your file at 2300 hours," Kincaid countered smoothly. "Refusing to comply with medical transfer is grounds for immediate physical intervention. It was perfectly constructed. A false mental health emergency requiring immediate response conducted during shift change when oversight was minimal. Any unfortunate outcome would be attributed to necessary restraint of a resistant, unstable inmate." "I don't believe this is a legitimate transfer," Teach replied calmly. "I request federal oversight of any movement, as provided by the emergency injunction. Request denied. On your feet, or you will be forcibly removed." As the extraction team stepped forward, the facility's alarm system suddenly erupted into deafening life. Emergency lights bathed the corridor in pulsing red. Over the public address system, an automated voice announced, "Security protocol initiated. All personnel remain in position. All movement suspended." Kincaid froze, confusion crossing his features. "What the hell?" One of the officers touched his radio. "Sir, main control reports a security breach in the admin section. Federal marshals are sealing all corridors." "Override it," Kincaid snapped. "Complete the extraction." The officer hesitated. "Sir, surveillance systems just reactivated in all restricted areas, including this corridor." Kincaid's head jerked up toward the ceiling camera he'd personally disabled an hour earlier. The small red light was now blinking steadily, recording everything. Even as Kincaid processed this development, new voices echoed from the main corridor. Federal marshals advancing systematically through the facility, securing each section. "Sergeant Kincaid," one of the disguised officers said urgently, "we need to abort. This is outside protocol." Teach remained motionless, watching as Kincaid's carefully orchestrated scenario disintegrated around him. The sergeant's face contorted with rage and disbelief, his control slipping away with each passing second. "Sir," the officer insisted, backing toward the door, "we need to disperse now." Kincaid didn't acknowledge him, his focus locked entirely on Teach. "You did this," he said, voice barely audible beneath the blaring alarms. "Somehow you did this." "No, Sergeant," Teach replied evenly. "You did this to yourself. Every time, you chose control over justice. Every time you manipulated the system for power rather than rehabilitation." Kincaid's hand moved to his belt, fingers closing around his baton. For one tense moment it seemed he might lash out, one final act of violence before his world collapsed completely. Instead, he straightened, composing himself with visible effort. "This changes nothing. The system will protect its own, it always does." "Perhaps," Teach acknowledged, "but not forever, and not this time." As federal marshals rounded the corner, Kincaid and his extraction team had no choice but to surrender control of the corridor, and with it, their last opportunity to silence the truth Teach represented. Dawn broke over Coldwater's yard, painting the concrete walls with soft gold light that belied the institutional harshness. For the first time in memory, inmates from all blocks mingled freely under the watchful but uncertain gaze of both regular guards and federal officers. The facility had entered unprecedented territory, neither fully under prison administration nor completely controlled by federal authorities. In this liminal space, old boundaries temporarily dissolved as investigations proceeded. Teach stood in the center of the yard, surrounded by a loose gathering of inmates whose faces reflected cautious hope mixed with ingrained skepticism. 3 years of careful work had culminated in this moment. Not freedom, not justice fully realized, but the first genuine crack in a system designed to resist change. Across the yard, Davis conferred with federal agents, occasionally glancing toward the inmate gathering. Beside her stood Gentry, officially designated as a cooperating witness. His testimony now part of the public record rather than private. Notes in a hidden journal. The yard gate opened to admit a small procession, marshals escorting Kincaid now in handcuffs. The official charges included civil rights violations, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and assault. His expression remained defiant as they led him across the yard toward the processing area. As they passed the gathered inmates, a remarkable transformation occurred. Without coordination, without signal, the men fell silent and still. The same, powerful non-compliance they had demonstrated in the cafeteria, now directed not as protest but as witness. Hundreds of eyes followed Kincaid's progress, neither taunting nor celebrating, simply observing. The weight of their collective gaze, men, whose humanity he had systematically denied, seemed to physically burden him. His shoulders hunched, his stride faltered. For the first time, perhaps, Kincaid experienced what he had inflicted on countless others, the feeling of being powerless under observation, stripped of authority, reduced to an object of institutional processing. When he passed Teach, he paused, briefly, searching for words that might preserve some dignity in defeat. Teach offered none, no final condemnation, no righteous declaration. Just the same quiet observation he had maintained since his first day at Coldwater. In that silence lay a truth more powerful than any accusation, that Kincaid's downfall came not from Teach's actions, but from the exposure of his own. 1 month later, Teach sat in the newly established education center, the former chapel, now repurposed as both classroom and community space, under the federally mandated reforms. Around him, inmates gathered for the expanded literacy program, their participation no longer tied to informant expectations or administrative favor. Jenkins approached, moving more easily now that his proper medication regimen had been restored. "New guy from the Oversight Committee wants to see you," he said, nodding toward the door. Gentry stood there in civilian clothes, a visitor badge clipped to his shirt. The past month had aged him. Shadows beneath his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. But there was something else in his face, too. Purpose, perhaps, or the particular peace that comes from choosing right over comfortable. "Officer Gentry," Teach greeted him. "Just Gentry now," he corrected. "I've been reassigned to the Oversight Committee as a consultant, helping them understand how the system worked from the inside." "Important work," Gentry nodded. "I wanted you to know, the corporate review is recommending Coldwater be transitioned to state management. The for-profit model is under federal scrutiny now." "And the inmates?" "Case-by-case reviews of sentences and conditions. Your appeal has been prioritized." Gentry hesitated. "It won't fix everything. The system's too big, too entrenched for overnight change." "Change rarely happens overnight," Teach replied. "It happens one mind at a time, one choice at a time." Gentry glanced around the classroom. "Smoke's running group sessions in East Block now using your curriculum. He always had leadership qualities, just needed the right direction." "And you?" Gentry asked. "What happens when your case is reviewed, when you leave this place?" Teach considered the question thoughtfully. "There's teaching to be done everywhere, inside these walls or outside them." As Gentry left, Smoke entered from the opposite door, his cast removed but arm still held carefully. The former gang leader now carried a stack of books, his fearsome reputation transformed into something different but equally powerful, respected not for violence but for resilience. "Ready for this afternoon session?" Teach asked. "Got 15. Signed up already," Smoke confirmed. "Working on critical thinking and civic responsibility." A hint of a smile crossed his face. "Figure they should understand the system they're living in. And that they have the power to change it," Teach added. Through the windows they could see the yard where inmates still gathered in their historical groupings. Old habits and divisions wouldn't disappear overnight. But small changes were visible to the observant eye. Conversation between formerly hostile factions, shared resources, the tentative formation of community beyond enforced order. Warden Draper had resigned, replaced temporarily by a federal administrator. Chaplain Wickers had been transferred to a minimum security facility where his influence was greatly diminished. The corporate owners were frantically distancing themselves from the rogue management of Coldwater, even as their own policies came under scrutiny. Yet the physical structure remained, concrete and steel, locks and bars, the fundamental reality of incarceration unchanged. What had changed, what continued to change, was the invisible architecture of power within those walls. Teach gathered his materials for the afternoon session, aware that his work at Coldwater was far from complete. The quiet revolution had never been about dramatic overthrow or wholesale transformation. It had been about revealing truth, about awakening consciousness, about demonstrating that even within systems designed to crush humanity, humanity could still assert itself, one mind at a time, one choice at a time, one truth at a time. That afternoon, as he stood before a classroom of men whose paths to Coldwater had been paved with both their own choices and society's failures, Teach began as he always did, not with rules or demands or power plays, but with a question that invited each man to reclaim his own voice. What does justice mean to you? And in the thoughtful silence that followed, in the careful consideration before the first hesitant voice responded, the quiet revolution continued. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.